stop for a second and imagine this. A beautiful wedding hall filled with smiling guests, soft music playing, cameras flashing, and a father standing proudly beside the woman he believes is the love of his life. Everything looks perfect. But then, right before the celebration speeches begin, his own son suddenly stands up. At first, everyone thinks it's just a sweet moment. Maybe the son wants to thank his father. Maybe he wants to welcome his new stepmom into the family. But the look on the boy's face tells a completely different story. His hands are shaking. His voice is heavy. And what he's about to reveal will freeze every single person in that room. Because this son isn't standing up to celebrate the wedding. He's standing up to stop it. You see, for months he'd been noticing strange things about his father's new fiancée. Secret phone calls. Questions about money. Late-night meetings she thought no one knew about. At first, he tried to ignore it. He told himself maybe he was just being overprotective. After all, his father had been lonely for years after losing his wife. He deserved happiness again, right? But then one night, the son overheard a phone call that sent chills down his spine. A conversation that sounded less like love and more like a plan involving marriage, a plan involving money, and a plan that could destroy his father's life forever. So the son did something no one expected. He started digging for the truth. What he discovered was so shocking, so heartbreaking, that he knew one thing for sure. If he stayed silent, his father could lose everything. But exposing the truth meant risking something else. It meant humiliating his father on the happiest day of his life. It meant destroying a wedding in front of hundreds of guests. And it meant confronting a woman who had carefully hidden her secrets from everyone. So now, standing in the middle of the wedding hall, with every guest watching, the son pulls out his phone and presses play. Within seconds, the entire room goes silent. The bride's face turns pale. The father can't believe what he's hearing. And the perfect wedding begins to fall apart, piece by piece. What did the son discover? What secret was the bride hiding? And why did the guests freeze when the final truth came out? Stay with this story, because what happens next will shock you. Sometimes the most painful truth is the one that saves a family. The soft sound of violin music filled the elegant wedding hall as guests smiled, laughed, and enjoyed the beautiful celebration. White roses decorated every table. Golden lights shimmered across the ceiling, and waiters moved quietly through the crowd carrying trays of drinks. Everything looked perfect. But sometimes, the most perfect moments hide the darkest secrets. Richard Thompson stood near the center of the hall, dressed in a sharp black suit, greeting his friends and relatives with a warm smile. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. After years of loneliness and heartbreak, he was finally getting married again. 5 years earlier, Richard had lost his wife, Sarah, after a sudden illness. Her death had shattered the family. For months, Richard barely spoke to anyone. He buried himself in work and avoided social gatherings. Only one person truly understood how much pain he was going through: his son, David. David had been just 19 when his mother passed away. Even though he was struggling with the loss himself, he stayed strong for his father. The two had always shared a close bond, and after Sarah's death, they leaned on each other more than ever. But everything changed the day Melissa entered their lives. Richard had met Melissa 2 years ago at a charity event. She was charming, elegant, and seemed incredibly kind. She listened carefully whenever Richard spoke and showed sympathy for his past struggles. Within months, the two began dating. At first, David tried to be supportive. He understood that his father deserved happiness again. Seeing Richard smile after so many years of sadness felt like a good sign. But something about Melissa always made David uncomfortable. He couldn't explain it at first. It was just a feeling. A quiet voice in the back of his mind telling him that something wasn't right. Over time, small details started to catch his attention. Whenever Melissa visited their home, she asked many questions about Richard's business. She wanted to know about his investments, his company partners, and the properties he owned. At first, David thought maybe she was simply curious. But the questions never stopped. One evening during dinner, Melissa casually asked, "Richard, how many buildings does your company own now?" Richard laughed proudly. "Around 12 properties across the city." Melissa's eyes sparkled for a brief moment. "Wow," she said. "That must be worth millions." David noticed that moment, and it stayed in his mind. A few weeks later, David walked into the living room and overheard Melissa speaking on the phone. The moment she noticed him, she quickly ended the call. Her smile appeared forced. "Oh, David," she said nervously. "I didn't hear you come in." Again, that strange feeling returned. Still, David tried to ignore it. He told himself he was just being overly protective of his father. Months passed, and Richard eventually announced the news. He was going to marry Melissa. Friends and family were excited. Everyone congratulated him and praised Melissa for bringing happiness back into his life. But David couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Now the wedding day had finally arrived. The large ballroom was filled with over 100 guests. Beautiful flower arrangements lined the stage where the ceremony had taken place earlier. Laughter and music echoed across the room as people celebrated the newly married couple. Melissa stood beside Richard in a stunning white dress, greeting guests and accepting compliments. She looked radiant, confident, almost too confident. Across the room, David sat quietly at a table near the back of the hall. While everyone else laughed and celebrated, he watched. His eyes moved carefully between his father and Melissa. His mind replayed every strange moment from the past year. The phone calls, the questions about money, the uncomfortable silence whenever he entered the room. David clenched his hands together under the table. For weeks he had been debating whether he should say anything. Part of him feared he might be wrong. What if he destroyed his father's happiness for nothing? But another part of him knew that if he stayed silent and something terrible happened later, he would never forgive himself. Suddenly, the host of the event stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host announced cheerfully, holding a microphone. "What beautiful celebration today. Let's give another round of applause for Richard and Melissa." The guests clapped enthusiastically. Richard wrapped his arm around Melissa as they smiled for the crowd. "Now," the host continued, "we will begin the speech portion of the evening. If any close family members would like to share a few words for the happy couple, please come forward." Several guests looked toward David. As Richard's only son, many expected him to say something emotional and heartfelt. David slowly looked down at the table. His heart was pounding. This was the moment he had been thinking about for weeks. If he stayed silent now, the opportunity would be gone forever. He took a deep breath. Across the room, Melissa laughed with a group of guests, completely relaxed, confident that nothing could ruin this perfect day. But David knew something she didn't. He slowly pushed his chair back. The legs of the chair scraped softly against the floor. A few guests turned their heads. David stood up. The room was still filled with cheerful chatter as he began walking toward the stage. Step by step, his heart beat louder with every movement. Richard noticed him approaching and smiled proudly. "That's my boy," he whispered to Melissa. Melissa turned and watched David walk toward the microphone. For a brief moment, her smile faded. David stepped onto the stage and picked up the microphone. The music slowly faded. Guests turned their chairs toward him. The room grew quieter. Many expected a warm speech, maybe a touching story about his father. But the serious expression on David's face made several people uneasy. He looked across the crowd, then directly at Melissa. The entire room fell completely silent. And in that moment, no one knew that the next word spoken would stop the entire wedding in its tracks. David stood at the center of the stage, holding the microphone tightly in his hands. The entire wedding hall had gone quiet. More than 100 guests were now watching him with curiosity and anticipation. Some guests smiled, expecting a heartfelt speech. Others whispered softly to each other. David looked across the room and saw familiar faces, relatives, family friends, and business partners of his father. Many of them had known him since he was a child. To them, this was simply the moment when a son would say something emotional about his father's new marriage. But David knew this moment would be very different. He slowly took a deep breath. His heart was pounding so loudly that he could almost hear it echoing in his ears. Across the room, Richard smiled proudly at his son. He raised his glass slightly, encouraging him to speak. Beside him, Melissa watched quietly. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were focused sharply on David. David finally leaned closer to the microphone. "First," he said slowly, his voice steady but serious. "I want to say that I love my father very much." A few guests nodded warmly. Richard smiled wider, clearly touched by the opening words. David continued, "My father is one of the strongest people I know. After losing my mother 5 years ago, I watched him struggle with loneliness and heartbreak. There were days when it felt like our home had lost all its light." The guests listened quietly. Some people lowered their heads respectfully, remembering the difficult time after Sarah's death. David's voice softened. "But through all of that," he continued, "my father kept going. He worked hard, he stayed strong, and he did everything he could to build a better future for both of us." Richard's eyes grew slightly emotional. This was the kind of speech he expected. A loving tribute from his son. But David's tone slowly changed. "And because I love my father," he said carefully, "I believe it's my responsibility to protect him." The guests exchanged confused glances. Richard's smile faded slightly. "What do you mean, son?" he asked gently. David looked directly at him. "Dad, for months I've been struggling with something." The room grew even quieter. Melissa shifted slightly in her chair. David continued speaking. "I didn't want to say anything today. I told myself maybe I was wrong. I told myself maybe I misunderstood certain things." He paused. "But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that if I stayed silent, I might regret it for the rest of my life." Now the mood in the room had completely changed. Guests were no longer smiling. Many people leaned forward in their seats. Richard's face showed concern. "David," he said cautiously, "this is a wedding. If something is bothering you, we can talk about it later." David slowly shook his head. "No, Dad," he replied gently. "It has to be said now." Melissa suddenly spoke up. "David," she said politely but firmly, "maybe this isn't the right moment." Her smile appeared calm, but her voice carried a hint of tension. David looked at her. For a brief moment, their eyes locked. "Actually," he said quietly, "this is exactly the right moment." A wave of whispers spread through the guests. David reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "This may seem strange," he continued, "but a few weeks ago, something happened that made me start paying closer attention." Richard frowned slightly. "What are you talking about?" David raised the phone in his hand. "One evening," he explained, "I came home earlier than usual. When I walked into the house, I heard Melissa talking on the phone in the living room." Melissa's body suddenly stiffened. "At first," David said, "I didn't think anything of it. I wasn't trying to listen to her conversation." He paused, remembering the moment. "But then I heard something that made me stop." The room was now completely silent. Guests stared at him intensely. "I heard Melissa say something about the wedding," David continued. Richard looked confused. "And then," David said slowly, "I heard her talk about money." Melissa quickly shook her head. "This is ridiculous," she said lightly. "Everyone talks about money sometimes." But David ignored the interruption. "What she said next," he continued, "didn't sound like someone who was in love." Melissa's smile was gone now. David unlocked his phone. After hearing that conversation, he said, "I decided to start paying closer attention, and eventually, I realized something very disturbing." Richard's face showed growing anxiety. "What did you realize?" David looked down at his phone. Then he looked back up at his father. "I realized that Melissa might not be marrying you for the reasons everyone thinks." The room exploded into shocked whispers. Melissa stood up immediately. "That's enough," she snapped. "This is completely inappropriate." But David raised his hand slightly. "Before anyone jumps to conclusions," he said calmly, "I think everyone here deserves to hear something." Melissa's eyes widened. David pressed a button on his phone. A moment later, the sound of a recorded voice echoed through the speakers connected to the hall's sound system. The voice was clear and instantly recognizable. It was Melissa. "Once the wedding is finished," the voice said softly, "everything will belong to me." The crowd gasped. David stood silently as the recording continued. "His company, his house, his money, he trusts me completely." Melissa's face turned pale. The guests looked back and forth between David and the bride in disbelief. Richard looked like someone had just pulled the ground from beneath his feet. The recording continued. The son might be suspicious, Melissa's recorded voice said with a small laugh, but that won't matter after the marriage papers are signed. David slowly stopped the recording. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything before. Every single person in the room turned to look at Melissa. Her confident wedding smile had completely disappeared, and suddenly the perfect wedding no longer felt perfect at all. The silence in the wedding hall felt heavy, almost suffocating. After the recording ended, no one moved. The guests looked frozen in their seats, trying to understand what they had just heard. Slowly, all eyes turned toward Melissa. Her face had lost all color. Just minutes earlier, she had stood proudly beside Richard in a beautiful white wedding dress, smiling confidently at everyone in the room. Now that confidence had completely disappeared. Melissa suddenly stood up from her chair. "This is ridiculous," she said quickly, forcing out a laugh that sounded nervous and unnatural. "That recording is fake." Her voice echoed across the silent hall. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. David remained calm on the stage, holding the microphone. "It's not fake," he replied quietly. Melissa shook her head rapidly. "Yes, it is," she insisted. "Anyone can edit audio these days. This is some kind of trick." Richard slowly stood up from his seat. His face looked pale and confused, like someone trying to wake up from a nightmare. "Melissa," he said softly, his voice shaking slightly, "please tell me that isn't your voice." Melissa walked closer to him. "Of course it isn't," she said quickly. "Someone is trying to sabotage our wedding." But the nervousness in her eyes told a very different story. David took a slow breath. "I wish that were true," he said. Melissa turned toward him angrily. "You should be ashamed of yourself," she snapped, "trying to embarrass your own father on his wedding day." A few guests shifted uncomfortably, but David didn't react to her anger. Instead, he calmly walked toward the large screen behind the stage. "If that recording was the only thing I had," he said, "then maybe you could call a misunderstanding." Melissa's expression suddenly changed. "But unfortunately," David continued, "it isn't the only thing." He connected his phone to the projector. A large image appeared on the screen behind him. It showed several documents: bank account forms, transaction records, legal papers. The guests leaned forward, trying to read the information. "For the past 2 months," David explained, "I started looking into some things." Melissa's eyes widened. After hearing that phone conversation, he said, "I couldn't ignore my instincts anymore. So I hired someone to help me investigate." Whispers spread quickly through the crowd. "A private investigator," David added. Melissa's breathing became noticeably faster. "These documents," David continued, pointing to the screen, "show that Melissa opened 3 different bank accounts using variations of her name." The guests murmured loudly. "And all of these accounts," David said firmly, "are connected to my father's financial information." Richard stared at the screen in disbelief. "What?" he whispered. David continued explaining. 2 of these accounts were opened just 3 weeks ago. The third one was opened only 5 days ago. Melissa stepped forward angrily. "This proves nothing," she shouted. David turned toward her. "Actually," he said calmly, "it proves quite a lot." He changed the slide on the screen. Now another image appeared. This one caused an even bigger reaction from the crowd. It was a photograph. Melissa was standing outside a restaurant, but she wasn't alone. She was with another man. The date and time were visible in the corner of the image. It was from just 1 week earlier. Gasps filled the hall. Richard looked at the picture, completely stunned. Who is that?" he asked slowly. Melissa's lips trembled. "That's just a friend," she said quickly. David shook his head. "No," he replied. "He's not." He pointed at the screen again. The private investigator followed Melissa for several days. According to his report, this man has met her multiple times over the past month. The crowd erupted into shocked whispers. Richard looked like he could barely breathe. And during those meetings, David continued, they discussed their plan. Melissa suddenly grabbed a chair as if she needed support. Her confidence was completely gone now. "What plan?" Richard asked quietly. David looked at his father with sadness in his eyes. "The plan was simple," he said. He paused for a moment before continuing. Melissa marries you. Once the marriage is official, she gains legal access to your finances and property. The room felt tense enough to snap. Then, David continued slowly. She transfers a large portion of your money into those secret accounts. Melissa shook her head violently. No, that's not true. But David kept speaking. And after that, he said, she leaves the country with him. A loud wave of gas spread across the hall. Richard looked at Melissa like he was seeing a stranger. Tell me that's not true, he said softly. Melissa's eyes darted around the room, searching desperately for a way out. I can explain, she stammered. David spoke again. There's one more thing. He tapped his phone. Another short audio recording began to play. This time, Melissa's voice sounded clearer than ever. We just need to wait until after the wedding. The voice said, once I have access to everything, we'll leave together. The recording ended. The silence that followed felt even heavier than before. Richard slowly lowered himself into his chair, looking completely devastated. The woman he had trusted, the woman he had just married, had been planning to betray him from the very beginning. Melissa looked around at the guests. Their faces were filled with shock, disappointment, and disbelief. Her carefully built image had completely collapsed in front of everyone. Finally, Richard stood up again. He looked directly at her, and in a quiet voice filled with pain, he asked a question that everyone in the room was thinking. Was any of this real? The question hung in the air like a heavy storm cloud. Richard stood in the middle of the wedding hall, staring directly at Melissa. His eyes were filled with pain, confusion, and disbelief. Was any of this real? He asked again quietly. The guests sat frozen in their chairs. No one dared to speak. Even the music had stopped completely, leaving only the sound of quiet breathing and nervous whispers. Melissa looked around the room. Every face was staring at her. Just an hour earlier, these same people had been congratulating her, praising her beauty, and celebrating her marriage to Richard. Now their expressions had changed completely. Shock, disappointment, suspicion. For the first time since the ceremony began, Melissa seemed completely lost. Her lips trembled as she tried to form an answer. Richard, listen to me, she said, her voice shaking. This isn't what it looks like. But even she sounded unsure of her own words. Richard slowly shook his head. I heard the recordings, he said quietly. I saw the pictures. I saw the documents. He paused, taking a painful breath. I just want the truth. Melissa opened her mouth again, but no words came out. Her silence spoke louder than anything she could have said. The guests exchanged quiet whispers. David stood on the stage watching everything carefully. His heart was still pounding, but deep down he knew he had done the right thing. Melissa suddenly turned toward him, her eyes filled with anger. You did this, she shouted. The sudden outburst startled several guests. You ruined everything, she continued. You couldn't stand seeing your father happy. David didn't raise his voice. I wanted him to be happy, he replied calmly. But I also wanted him to be safe. Melissa let out a frustrated laugh. Safe from what? She demanded. David looked directly at her. From you. The words landed heavily in the silent room. Richard slowly stepped backward, creating distance between himself and Melissa. For the first time, he looked at her not with love, but with doubt. Tell me the truth, he said again. Melissa's shoulders dropped. Her confident posture was gone. The perfect image she had carefully built throughout the relationship had completely collapsed. She looked around the room one last time. Then she sighed deeply. For a moment, it seemed like she might finally confess. But instead, something inside her snapped. Fine, she suddenly shouted. The loud outburst made several guests jump. Yes, I talked about money, she admitted angrily. So what? Everyone cares about money. Richard stared at her in disbelief. That's not what you said in the recording, he replied. Melissa looked furious now. You want the truth? She snapped. The room became completely silent again. You were an easy target, she said coldly. Gasps filled the hall. Richard's face turned pale. Melissa continued speaking, her voice now filled with bitterness. You were lonely, she said. You were desperate for someone to love you again. That made everything simple. Several guests covered their mouths in shock. David felt anger rising in his chest, but he stayed silent. Melissa pointed toward the screen behind the stage. "Yes, I met someone else," she admitted. "And yes, we had plans." Richard looked like he could barely stand. "All I had to do," Melissa continued coldly, "was marry you first." The cruelty in her words stunned the entire room. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then Richard slowly straightened his posture. The pain in his face was still there, but something else had appeared as well. Strength. "You know what hurts the most?" he said quietly. Melissa rolled her eyes slightly. "What?" Richard looked toward David. "I almost lost my own son because I refused to listen to him." David felt a lump form in his throat. Richard then turned back to Melissa. "But today," he said firmly, "I'm grateful he had the courage to speak up." Melissa grabbed her purse angrily. "You will regret this," she said bitterly. But no one responded. Guests moved their chairs aside as she stormed toward the exit. The sound of her high heels echoed loudly across the silent hall. Just before reaching the door, she turned around one last time. "You think you've won," she said sharply. But Richard didn't answer. He simply looked away. Melissa pushed the door open and disappeared outside. The door slammed shut behind her. For a long moment, the wedding hall remained completely silent. The decorations, the flowers, the music, everything that had been prepared for a joyful celebration now felt strangely out of place. The wedding was over, but something much more important had just happened. Richard slowly walked toward the stage where David was standing. Every step felt heavy. David suddenly felt nervous. Part of him wondered if his father might still be angry. After all, he had just destroyed the wedding in front of hundreds of guests. But when Richard finally reached him, something unexpected happened. He pulled David into a tight hug. The guests watched quietly as father and son stood there together. "Thank you," Richard whispered. David felt his eyes start to water. "I'm sorry I didn't listen to you earlier." David shook his head gently. "I just didn't want you to get hurt," he said. Richard placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You saved me from making the biggest mistake of my life." Around them, some guests slowly began to clap. At first it was quiet. Then more people joined in. Soon the entire room filled with applause. Not for a wedding, but for the truth, for courage, and for a son who refused to stay silent when it mattered most. The wedding had been canceled that day, but in the end, something far more valuable had been protected. A father, a family, and the powerful reminder that sometimes the hardest truths are the ones that save us.